Hello, Mejabej. Welcome to the Literary Lens podcast, the Murky Middle. And no, Jackie, you were just saying something.
Well, if we want to introduce the topic where this came from, we were kicking around the idea of talking about genre blending and the popularity of mashups of different genres. And I was saying that I had recently had a conversation with a writer friend about romantasy and how hot romantasy is at the moment. And because I don't do a lot of romance or fantasy, I was saying, could you just explain romantasy? And she's like, oh, it's basically just fantasy with a different name. But because Anne does work in both those genres, I thought she could explain it to us.
Oh, so you're just gonna put me on the spot?
Yes,
Please.
I mean, I think that your writer friend was just pretty on the nail. It's fantasy with romance. That's the very simplest terms, I think, to explain romantasy. Is that it's a romance setting, but the romance is still the core element of the story and what propels the plot forward from beginning to end. So even though we are in a mystical world where trees come alive and they're probably gnomes because gnomes are my favorite.
Oh, I hate gnomes.
I love gnomes. Romance is at its core, so you're gonna you're skilled to get your meet cute and they get together and all the love, and then they break up, and then they get together again in the end. So, but there's also maybe rogue trees in the background. I don't know, and gnomes.
well, then is Sarah J. Maas fantasy or romantasy?
Okay, well, I have to admit that I have not read any
Okay.
Uh-oh.
her books, but I don't believe that her story structure follows a romance at its core. It follows fantasy. So it's a fantasy that has romance, but it is not a romance that is set in fantasy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
So my question is, we talked about this on your first episode of Quelling Your Query Conundrums. Does a romantasy have to be a second world?
I think for the genre that is kind of coming out, that is what it is. So now, do I think it always is going to have to be that way? No, I don't. But I think we're going to, like we were just talking about, I think we're going to see a lot more genre bending in the coming up years because we are getting to a point where we've seen a lot of things before. And so how are we going to make things feel fresh and new? So as we expand romantasy, I think it could easily take on a contemporary setting, but also have those fantasy elements while also still being a romance.
Okay. I get pitched sometimes paranormal fantasy romance, and personally, I hate the paranormal subgenre because people throw it around like, oh, a paranormal horror or a paranormal romance, and it's an urban fantasy, or or have you ever gotten pitched a paranormal romantasy?
I have a paranormal rom-com on my list right now.
Okay, so what makes it paranormal versus, say, fantasy or magical realism? Is it literally just the presence of, say, a ghost?
Kind of. So it's real world setting. It's very contemporary basis, but also there is an element of the paranormal that is involved.
So what makes it paranormal?
Well, I don't want to be like talking about this story.
Well, I mean, are we talking ghosts? Because I've gotten stuff with werewolves pitched as paranormal, and to me, I mean, that's not paranormal. When I think paranormal, I think real world. I think ghosts or spirits or Insidious, The Conjuring.
Okay, well, I think that paranormal actually is like a broader scope than that. It's not just ghosts. I think that so if you have a werewolf, then I think that could be considered paranormal. If you have a vampire, I think that could be considered paranormal. If you have I'm trying to think of anything else at the top of my head.
Gnomes.
Gnomes, maybe. I love
No, probably not gnomes.
Probably not gnomes.
No, vampires, werewolves, witches.
Yeah.
I mean, that's often called paranormal. And that may just be because we don't really have a category of supernatural, because on TV those would be called supernatural.
That's what I was just going to say, that we need to start pushing the phrase or the word supernatural.
Well, go ahead.
Supernatural is the word to go. So I would say supernatural romance. And I may be in the minority here, but that's I use supernatural because paranormal to me, I think Ghostbusters. But
Ghostbusters is awesome.
It is. I love Ghostbusters. Absolutely. I have no problem with I love Ghostbusters, but I mean, I think as a genre, paranormal is too vague of a word.
That's fair.
I think one thing too, and you may have covered this in query conundrums, but I was actually just giving a presentation on queries earlier this weekend. I think one thing is that people get very tied up about these categorizations. And, one thing I would suggest not doing in a query is putting in 6 genres, saying, well, this is a paranormal, supernatural, fantasy. Just pick one, because as you can see from us talking, these are subjective terms. We all have slightly different ways we conceptualize them. And at the end of the day, the agent will make that decision with you when sending the book out on submission, what they're going to submit it to an editor as. But I think at the agent query stage, people spend too much time stressing, and then it looks really bad when you put 6 genres in your query. Just pick one, we'll figure it out.
I think it gives your book an identity crisis.
Yep.
Yes. And I've received books like that are crime, thriller, action, adventure, horror, romance. That's not a genre. I can't pitch that to an editor. Just because it has a romance doesn't make it a romance. And what you were mentioning about working with the agent to determine a genre is interesting, because I submitted a paranormal romance and they made an offer as a horror.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, publishers will also come in and be like, yeah, we're totally pitching this as something else. I sold a horror and it's going out as a mystery thriller.
Huh. Yeah. Which is why, authors shouldn't stress about it when they're querying agents, because, titles change, genres change. I mean, that's all marketing stuff. And you don't really have to, you have to know your market, but if you can give a very clear idea in a 3 to 5 paragraph query letter as to what the book is, it really doesn't matter that much what label you put on it.
Yeah.
Okay. For knowing your market, what about tropes? Because genre bending, what do you do with tropes there?
What do you mean? What do you do with them?
You subvert them.
Okay, but how? Like, for example, Gabino Iglesias's The Devil Take You Home. It is very much a crime thriller until the very end, and you see there's a zombie with a gun, if I remember correctly. So it's squarely it's a horror, and it was sold, I think, as a horror, but it's very much a crime thriller throughout. Like, for a romantasy, what are the tropes you have to include to make it a romantasy?
I don't think there has to be specific tropes.
No, I think I agree with Anne, because there are some genres where if you're writing squarely within a genre, there are very clear expectations, like, romance or closed room murder mysteries and stuff like that. But I think if you're doing something a little more experimental, you will be playing with tropes. If there are romance elements, there are going to be misunderstandings, and there's going to be bits when the two love interests hate each other and then love each other again. But you don't have to follow, a romance plot line. And I think fantasy and sci-fi, like speculative, have lots of tropes, but I think there's a difference between a trope and a plot structure. So with a romance, there's a very expected plot structure. With a cozy closed room mystery, there's a very expected plot structure. But I don't think fantasy and sci-fi and paranormal have those very tight structures. I think there are tropes and you can throw them in and play with them and do whatever you want with them. But I define trope and plot structure as two different things.
Okay. So would you call what makes a cozy mystery, usually, I don't know if I can describe it properly, the bookshop keeper, murders off screen, that kind of stuff. Is that trope or is that plot structure?
I mean, that's plot structure to me.
Really?
But I could be wrong. I mean, again, because we all differ. And I mean, I'm thinking, even as I'm saying this, readers of, say, a closed room mystery have very clear expectations that certain things will happen. But then there's really clever authors playing with that right now. So, the success of Lucy Foley's The Guest List, the structure there, you don't know who the victim is, So it's like, it's got all the elements of a closed room murder. It's set on an island and there's this many people in the universe and they're all suspects, but you don't know who the victim is until the end. So even, there are expectations that there'll be this big scene where the truth comes out, but that's kind of about it at the moment with that genre, I think.
Are there any genres that don't go together? I saw this on Twitter the other day, maybe it was a few weeks ago. Someone saying that romance and horror are total opposites and don't go together whatsoever. But that's not true.
Yeah,
absolutely not true. I mean, I think some genres may work better, air quotes, together, like horror and comedy, I think work so well together because they're foundationally both the same. We're terrified of the unknown and we laugh at the unexpected.
Yeah,
I agree.
I think one that goes badly, but I think it's just because it's been done badly. There was that period in film where people were doing Western sci-fi, like with the aliens coming down and the cowboys fighting the aliens. And there were a couple of those movies, and I don't remember any of them being any good, but I don't think that's because you can't do a good Western sci-fi. I think it's just because it has been badly done.
I assume you're talking about Cowboys versus Aliens. With
that was one of them, but there were a couple that came out.
I actually loved Cowboys versus Aliens. Even though, I mean, I don't know how much of a cinematic breakthrough it is, but I mean, it was just a fun, entertaining movie.
Well, I don't know if I even saw it, but I just remember a lot of reviews panning a couple of those films when they came out. But, you enjoyed it, and that means it works. It's, it's entertaining. So, like, I don't know if there's I can't think of anything that you could ever just have a rule and say, never put this and this together, because that would never work. There's always a way. Anne's nodding. You have words.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I wouldn't watch a Western sci-fi, but that's because I don't really like Westerns that much. Unless they're lesbian cowgirls, like, then maybe I'd be interested in watching said Western sci-fi. But otherwise, probably.
Have either of you watched The Mandalorian?
My husband did, so I caught bits of episodes.
That's literally Western sci-fi.
And that did quite well.
It's a Star Wars show, but it's still completely Western sci-fi.
Well, Star Wars has a ton of Western sci-fi. Like, Han Solo is basically a cowboy in space.
Yes. So I guess I was thinking there must be genres that don't go well together or don't fit. But the more we're talking about it, I think they can all go together as long as you do them well. Like horror romance. There was a movie called Spring that was really a horror, but it was driven forward by the romance.
Yeah.
And probably All the Bones You Can Eat. Is that the name of it? There was a romance horror movie that came out maybe in the last year, and it's about two lovers who are cannibals and they're on the road eating people.
That's hysterical.
It sounds like Anne Rose's dream.
Okay, if that was a book, I'd read it. That sounds funny.
I think it was based on a book.
Excellent. Okay, so I've got to figure out where that came from.
I think I might have read the book because I haven't seen the movie, but I remember reading a book along those lines.
I remember something about the premise, but the title, I can't place the title.
Okay. So what are some of our favorite genre bending? And would you, for example, Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Ring, would that be a genre blend? Is that a romantasy?
Fourth Wing.
Fourth Wing, isn't that Rebecca Yaros's?
Yeah, you said
The
Fourth
Iron
Wing.
Flame?
I mean, I haven't read it. I will read it. It's on my TBR. Someone described it to me as if you like, what is it, Divergent as YA?
Divergent with Dragons is what I hear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you didn't read it, Anne?
No.
Oh, I guess only Natasha read it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll have to bring her on.
We'll bring her on and get her to explain it. But I will have read it at some point. But I mean, if it is Divergent with Dragons, then that's kind of a mashup of sci-fi, dystopian sci-fi and high fantasy, right? I guess.
Yeah. And I suppose that brings us to our second topic, high concept, because in order to be genre bending, doesn't it really need to be high concept because you're pitching it as two genres in one?
Yeah, like this meets that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that it helps in the traditional market. I don't know if it needs to be that way, but I think it does help when you're trying to sell it in this market.
Yeah.
Okay. So high concept is really a nothing word. I mean, we all know really what it means, but like Jackie was saying before, I think it means something different to anyone because for a long time, people were describing it as, I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
But I think now we do have a quote unquote definite definition. And I wonder what you two would define it as.
What would you define it as, Lane?
What would I think something you can describe in a sentence, but even then I think of just mainly this meets that.
Okay.
Like Western sci-fi cowboys versus aliens. It would be cowboys fight aliens in the West, 19th century West.
Yeah,
I
something
think that's
that
high
immediately
concept.
sets the tone, and you know immediately what it is. So, because you know how much I love to talk about it, one of my favorite books, my female serial killer book, Dexter Meets a Legally Blonde. You immediately know what you're going to get. High concept, female serial killer. Boom! This girl's a killer, coming out this September. Just every
Yes. We already optioned it up for film. I'm probably not allowed to say that, but whatevs. Okay, so what do we think? So high concepts have to involve, I think, maybe not necessarily comps. So what do we think of comps?
I talked a lot about this when I was doing the query panel a couple of days ago. And I do think it's one of those things like genre where, people get very, very, very stressed about it when you're querying an agent, and it's much better not to get stressed about it, because I think people overdo comps. And really, the way I think about comps, and I do think it's another one of those things that agents all have different views on. But at me as an agent, what I'm looking for is the author telling me where they think their book goes on the shelf. So I'm not looking for them to tell me, I'm the next J.K. Rowling, I'm the next to, that was all the Harry Potter comps back in middle grade. I'm also not looking for the author to tell me how well read they are. I don't want them to say, this has the very finite blah, blah, blah of this person with the really luscious setting of blah, blah, blah. That it's fine if you do that. Obviously, I'm not going to reject your query if you do that. But I'm just looking for you to tell me where you think your book fits in the market. So in that sense, it's similar to what you're doing with the high concept pitches, although if it isn't high concept, you're just saying, well, readers of this author and this author will enjoy my book for these elements. So to me, that's what it is. It's a market thing. It's not an art thing. It's not a craft thing. And you don't have to be right. There's no right answer. I just want to know what you think your project is as a product, for want of a better word.
Okay. I used to think exactly like that, except on the Anne Rose's Quelling Your Query Conundrums, the first episode. Everyone check it out. Anne mentioned, and I noticed this, that editors write their where are they? The P&Ls to comps because they need to show how many copies they think they will sell. And I always assumed, and what I was told was, editors were just guessing, but Anne said they derive it from the comps. So it seems like for publishers and editors, comps are much more important than we seem to think.
No, but that's a different question, because that's when we're pitching to editors. I'm talking about when an author is pitching to an agent, because the comps I gave an example in this talk I did the other day where I was talking about Lynn Miller Lockman's Torch, which won the LA Times Book Award, just pitching our clients.
Yay!
Here. But that one, I was using her query letter to me and my query letter to the editor as examples. And I completely changed the comps because she had comped to, it is a historical fiction novel. I actually comped to some cross-cultural dystopian novels because the themes were very dystopian. So I did comp to some YA historical fiction authors, but I focused on the dystopian aspects of the story. And I think that's what they used in-house. So that's why I say I don't know that authors should get too stressed about it, because it's our job to know how to do what you're talking about, Lane, which is to tell the editor what comps to put in the P&L.
Okay, I'll agree with that, but I also think in this hypersensitive time, authors want to be more in control or have a more transparent relationship with agents. So I've come up with comps and have had to change them to appease clients. And I'm not thinking of any situation because I couldn't remember for the life of me. I just remember having had to do it. And I remember editors having changed comps and personally being irked about it because I thought our comps were much better. But I'm sure they did that in order to get a more accurate P&L.
Well, I have a question for you then. Do you find that more the case in fiction or nonfiction, or the same?
Oh, okay. Fiction. More in fiction. I think in nonfiction,
it's more
the
obvious.
comps at some point, as far as I know, don't even matter, because nonfiction, part of the proposal is a section called overview or whatever that describes why the author is the author to write that book. So we want to show that no one else can write that book.
Yep.
Like Dr. Austin Lim's book that details mental health through the lens of horror and science fiction novels.
Yep.
He's a neuroscientist, so I mean, he teaches that as a course. So there's not that many people, I think, that are going to be able to teach that. So where's the comps?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more about the market section where you're talking about competing and complementary titles, and you're saying, well, there's these 3 books that are going to appeal to a similar audience but are on a different subject matter, and then there's academic books that are more but that's not really the same kind of comp that we're talking about with fiction.
And with nonfiction, I sometimes struggle with that section the most.
Yeah.
There is a ton of research involved, and sometimes you're only finding books that were done by academic presses, whereas I'm trying to sell it to Penguin Random House.
Right.
I want it on bookshelves everywhere. And editors are saying it's too academic, and I have to come back and say, no, look at all these great comps. And they say, well, those are academic presses. I'm like, yeah, but I want a lot of money. Give me a lot of money.
Yeah, we want to retire young.
Yeah.
That is not why we do this, but
no, not at all. Okay, so I think we're going to cut because we are going to dip into our bonus episode. If you subscribe, join our Patreon, you'll get access to it. So we are checking out, but thank you for joining us, the Murky Middle on the Literary Lens podcast, and hopefully everything is coming up Millhouse.